In 1933, a Chinese laborer working on a bridge over the Songhua River in Harbin, in what was then Japanese-occupied Manchuria, unearthed an enormous, unmistakably ancient human skull. Fearing the occupying Japanese authorities would seize it if he reported the find, he did. Something that would keep one of the most important human fossils on Earth hidden for the better part of a century. He wrapped it up and lowered it into an abandoned well on his family's property, told almost no one, and kept the secret for the rest of his life. Only shortly before he died did he finally tell his family where to find it. In 2018, they recovered the skull and donated it to Hebei GEO University. 3 years later, in 2021, scientists finally described it publicly, and the skull immediately became one of the most controversial fossils in the entire field of human evolution. So unlike anything else in the fossil record, that researchers gave it an entirely new species name. Then, just 4 years after that, in the summer of 2025, an entirely separate breakthrough revealed something even more astonishing about who this skull actually belonged to. A twist that finally solved one of the biggest open mysteries in the whole story of human evolution. Let's start with what made this skull so genuinely strange in the first place, because the anatomy itself is worth understanding in detail before we get to the DNA. Nicknamed Dragon Man, after Heilongjiang, the Black Dragon River province where it was discovered, the skull belonged to what researchers estimated was a physically massive adult male, likely in his 50s, with a skull large enough to house a brain of roughly 1,500 cubic centimeters, comparable to, and in some estimates larger than, the average modern human brain. But the rest of the skull looked nothing like a modern human at all. It had a long, low, almost rectangular brain case, a face described by researchers as flat and broad, with an unusually wide mouth, massive, thick brow ridges sitting above the eyes like a shelf, a broad nose, and eye sockets that were nearly square rather than the more rounded shape typical of modern human skulls. Radiometric dating using uranium series methods on the sediment attached to the fossil, along with geochemical analysis, placed the skull at a minimum age of about 146,000 years old, situating it firmly within a genuinely pivotal, chaotic period of human evolution known as the Middle Pleistocene, an era when multiple different human species, our own included, were coexisting, and in some cases interbreeding, across the same landmasses. When a team of researchers led by paleontologist Chang Ji formally described the skull in 2021, publishing their findings across 3 simultaneous papers, they made a genuinely bold, controversial call. Rather than assigning the skull to any existing known species, they argued its combination of features was distinctive enough to warrant an entirely new species designation, Homo longi, Dragon River Man. That was a significant claim to make, and it immediately split the paleoanthropology community. Some researchers argued the skull's features, while unusual, fell within a plausible range of variation for already known, if poorly understood, archaic human populations from Asia, rather than requiring a brand new species label entirely. Others pointed out that the skull shared certain features with a genuinely enigmatic and long-debated group of Chinese fossils, sometimes informally lumped together as mid-Pleistocene Asian hominins, remains that had puzzled researchers for decades precisely because they didn't cleanly match Homo erectus, Neanderthals, or modern humans, but that also hadn't yet been formally sorted into a clear, agreed-upon species of their own. And a third camp, including several scientists who'd been closely following an entirely separate mystery unfolding since 2010, had a hunch about something else entirely. They suspected Dragon Man might actually be a Denisovan. To understand why that specific hunch mattered so much, you need to understand just how strange and frustrating the Denisovan story had already been for the 15 years leading up to Dragon Man's public unveiling. In 2010, researchers extracted DNA from a tiny, unremarkable-looking fragment of a finger bone discovered in Denisova cave in Siberia, and the genetic sequence that came back stunned the entire field. It didn't match Neanderthal DNA, and it didn't match modern human DNA either. It represented an entirely new, previously unknown population of ancient humans, later named Denisovans, after the cave where that first fragment was found. Since then, researchers have confirmed that Denisovans interbred with the ancestors of modern humans, leaving a measurable genetic legacy that persists today, specifically in Melanesian and some other Asian and Pacific populations, with some groups in Papua New Guinea carrying as much as 4 to 6% Denisovan DNA. That's a genuinely remarkable scientific fact on its own, an entire vanished human population whose genes are still walking around inside living people today. But here's the maddening part that had frustrated paleoanthropologists for a decade and a half. Every single piece of confirmed Denisovan physical evidence recovered up to that point consisted of nothing more than fragments, a finger bone, a handful of isolated teeth, a partial jawbone found off the coast of Taiwan, a fragment of skull. Scientists knew with genuine confidence that Denisovans existed, that they'd interbred with our own species, and that they'd once spread widely enough across Asia to leave a genetic trace in living populations today. What they had never had, not once, in 15 years of searching, was an actual, reasonably complete skull. They knew Denisovans were real. They had no idea what a Denisovan actually looked like. That's precisely the gap Dragon Man threatened and ultimately managed to fill, though getting there proved to be its own genuinely difficult scientific puzzle. Shortly after the 2021 announcement, paleogeneticist Qiaomei Fu, from the Institute of Vertebrate Paleontology and Paleoanthropology in Beijing, reached out to the original research team and asked permission to attempt something that sounded almost impossibly ambitious, extracting usable ancient DNA directly from the skull itself. Fu's team tested 6 separate bone samples, taken from the fossil's single surviving tooth and from its petrous bone, a dense, notoriously DNA-rich structure at the base of the skull that has become one of paleogenetics' most reliable sources of ancient genetic material in fossils this old. The results, frustratingly, came back empty. 146,000 years is an extraordinarily long time for genetic material to survive intact, especially in a specimen that had already spent decades sitting at the bottom of a well before finally reaching a laboratory, and the DNA extraction attempt simply failed to produce usable results. But Fu's team didn't stop there, and this is where the story takes its first genuinely clever scientific turn. Even when DNA itself has degraded beyond recovery, fossilized bone can sometimes still preserve fragments of ancient proteins, which, while offering less detailed genetic information than DNA itself, can still carry enough of a molecular signature to identify meaningful evolutionary relationships. Proteins tend to survive considerably longer than DNA in the archaeological record precisely because their molecular structure is more chemically stable over very long timescales. Fu's team extracted protein fragments from the same petrous bone samples and compared the resulting protein sequences against reference data from modern humans, Neanderthals, confirmed Denisovan specimens, and non-human primates. The comparison pointed in one consistent direction. The protein evidence suggested Dragon Man belonged to a Denisovan population. Then came a second, entirely independent breakthrough that turned a strong suggestion into something considerably closer to confirmation. Researchers managed to recover ancient mitochondrial DNA, not from the bone itself this time, but from dental calculus, the hardened plaque that had built up on the skull's surviving tooth over the individual's lifetime and remained preserved on its surface for 146,000 years. Dental plaque, it turns out, can sometimes trap and preserve genetic material, even when the underlying bone and tooth structure has degraded too much to yield usable DNA on its own, a genuinely clever workaround that gave Fu's team a second independent line of evidence to test. The mitochondrial DNA extracted from that ancient plaque matched known Denisovan genetic sequences, 2 entirely separate methods: ancient protein analysis from the bone and ancient DNA recovered from fossilized dental plaque arrived at the same conclusion through completely different routes. Published across 2 papers in June 2025, one in the journal Cell and one in Science, the combined findings amounted to about as close to definitive proof as paleogenetics typically gets on a specimen this old and this previously uncertain. Dragon Man wasn't a mysterious, unclassifiable new species after all. He was a Denisovan, and remarkably, the very first reasonably complete Denisovan skull ever recovered. It's worth pausing on just how significant that specific outcome actually is, because it solves a problem that had genuinely stumped the field for a decade and a half. As Smithsonian paleoanthropologist Ryan McRae put it when the findings were published, this represented among the biggest paleoanthropology papers of the entire year, and one likely to keep generating scientific debate for a long time to come. For 15 years, Denisovans existed in the scientific imagination purely as a kind of ghost population, real, genetically confirmed, genetically influential on living humans today, but visually and anatomically almost entirely unknown. Now, thanks to a skull that spent decades hidden at the bottom of a well, specifically to keep it out of the hands of a wartime occupying power, researchers finally have what lead protein researcher Qiaomei Fu and her colleagues described as the first comprehensive morphological blueprint for Denisovan populations, addressing a question that had persisted unresolved for the entire previous decade: what Denisovans actually looked like. And the answer, it turns out, is startling in its own right. A huge, heavily built individual with a massive brow ridge, an enormous jaw and mouth, a broad nose, and a brain as large as or larger than a typical modern human's, housed inside a skull shape, unlike anything in our own direct lineage. There's an important scientific nuance worth including here too, because not every researcher in the field considers the case fully, permanently closed, and it's worth representing that honestly rather than overselling the certainty. Some scientists who weren't involved in the 2025 studies have noted that while the combined protein and mitochondrial DNA evidence is genuinely compelling, mitochondrial DNA alone only traces maternal lineage and represents a comparatively small fraction of an organism's total genetic information, meaning some researchers would prefer to see full nuclear genome sequencing, which would capture inheritance from both parents, before considering the Denisovan identification absolutely beyond any possible dispute. That's a reasonable, standard scientific caveat rather than a serious counterargument. And the overwhelming weight of both the 2025 written by something that has read everything ever published about it and has no built-in mechanism for weighing peer-reviewed radiocarbon dating more heavily than a 50-year-old psychic prophecy or a documentary hosted by a Hollywood actor. It also helps to understand that the exact wording of a question shapes an AI's answer far more than previously puzzling fossils scattered across China and beyond. With a confirmed, genetically verified Denisovan skull finally in hand, researchers now have an actual physical reference point they can compare other ambiguous fossils against, something that simply didn't exist before 2025. In September of that same year, a separate study proposed that remains from 6 additional sites across China, including a roughly 1 million-year-old skull known as Yongxian Man, a specimen far older than Dragon Man itself, might belong to the same broader Homo longi lineage now confirmed to include genetically verified Denisovans. Other previously perplexing partial fossils, including the Xiahe mandible, a jawbone recovered from the Tibetan plateau that had already yielded tentative Denisovan protein signals in earlier research, and Penghu 1, a jaw dredged up from the seabed near Taiwan, are increasingly being reconsidered and potentially reclassified in light of Dragon Man's confirmed identity. There's even active, ongoing debate among researchers about what the eventual official species name for Denisovans as a whole should actually be, with several scientists suggesting Homo longi itself, the name originally coined for what turned out to be a Denisovan skull, might ultimately become the formal permanent scientific name for the entire Denisovan population, while other researchers have proposed an alternative name, Homo joliensis, to encompass this same cluster of related Asian fossils instead. That naming debate remains genuinely unresolved, a reminder that even a discovery this significant doesn't instantly settle every downstream question it raises. Step back and consider the full arc of this story, because it's genuinely remarkable how many separate strands of scientific detective work had to come together to reach this point. A terrified laborer hides a skull in a well specifically to protect it from a wartime occupying army, inadvertently preserving one of the most important human fossils ever found for 85 years. His family finally recovers it decades later and hands it to science. Researchers spend 3 years analyzing its unusual anatomy before controversially declaring it an entirely new species in 2021. A separate research team, driven by a hunch connecting it to an entirely different 15-year-old genetic mystery, spends years attempting increasingly sophisticated extraction techniques, failing with direct DNA sequencing, succeeding instead through ancient protein analysis and, remarkably, genetic material recovered from fossilized dental plaque. And the eventual answer doesn't just settle what this one particular skull actually was, it retroactively reshapes how researchers are now re-examining an entire scattered collection of previously unclassifiable fossils across China, potentially rewriting the geographic range, physical appearance, and evolutionary story of an entire vanished human population that most of us had never even heard of until genetic testing revealed its existence from nothing more than a single finger bone back in 2010. It's worth going back further and spending more time on the original 2010 Denisovan discovery itself, because understanding just how thin the original evidence was makes the 2025 breakthrough land with even more weight. The specimen that started it all was almost comically tiny, a fragment of a pinky finger bone, barely large enough to be noticed, recovered from Denisova Cave in the Altai Mountains of Siberia, a site that had already been under archaeological excavation for years. When researchers sequenced mitochondrial DNA from that fragment in 2010, they expected at most to confirm it belonged to either a Neanderthal or an early modern human, since those were the only 2 hominin populations known to have inhabited that region during the relevant time period. Instead, the genetic sequence came back looking like nothing anyone had cataloged before, distinct enough from both Neanderthals and modern humans to represent an entirely separate branch of the human family tree, one that had split off and evolved independently for hundreds of thousands of years. It's hard to overstate how startling that was at the time. Researchers had, essentially by accident, discovered an entirely new kind of ancient human from a single bone fragment smaller than a fingernail clipping, and named the group after nothing more specific than the cave the fragment happened to be found in, because they step back and consider the full arc of this story, because it's genuinely remarkable how many separate strands of scientific detective work had to come together to reach this point. A terrified laborer hides a skull in a well specifically to protect it from a wartime occupying army, inadvertently preserving one of the most important human fossils ever found for 85 years. His family finally recovers it decades later and hands it to science. Research over the individual's lifetime and remained preserved on its surface for 146,000 years in 2021. A separate research team, driven by a hunch connecting it to an entirely different 15-year-old genetic mystery, spends years attempting increasingly sophisticated extraction techniques, failing with direct DNA sequencing, succeeding instead through ancient protein analysis and, remarkably, genetic material recovered from fossilized dental plaque. And the eventual answer doesn't just settle what this one particular skull actually was, it retroactively reshapes how researchers are now re-examining an entire roots. Published across 2 papers in June 2025, one in the journal Cell and one in Science, the combined findings amounted to about as close to definitive proof as paleogenetics typically gets on a specimen this old and this previously uncertain. Dragon Man wasn't a mysterious, unclassifiable, and powerful piece of ammunition the alternative history movement has ever been handed by mainstream science itself, and it gets invoked constantly in exactly this kind of conversation over the individual's lifetime and remained preserved on its surface for 146,000 years. And as far as any physical evidence shows, no known connection whatsoever. Which brings us back, once more, to the actual question people are typing into Grok. Just like with the Eisenhower alien treaty story, what is happening here is not an artificial intelligence conducting independent archaeological research, cross-referencing seismic data, or secretly accessing classified excavation records. What is happening is a language model doing exactly what it was built to do, predicting the most statistically likely continuation of a conversation based on the vast ocean of roots. Published across 2 papers in June 2025, one in the journal Cell and one in Science, the combined findings amounted to about as close to definitive proof as paleogenetics typically gets on a specimen this old and this previously uncertain. Dragon Man wasn't a mysterious, unclassifiable in specificity, entire cable television series built around exactly this premise, and a century-old psychic prophet, psi still circulating in the background of it all. When a model trained on that entire corpus is asked a leading question that already assumes the pyramids are 10,000 years old and that someone external gave the Egyptians the plans, it does not have some internal fact-checking department cross-referencing radiocarbon dates against fringe claims before responding. It reaches for the most coherent, most frequently repeated, most confidently worded narrative sitting inside its training data. And on this topic, that narrative has had 50 years, and a small library's worth of material to become extremely well-polished in 2 entirely separate methods: ancient protein analysis from the bone and ancient DNA recovered from fossilized dental plaque, arrived at the same conclusion through completely new species after all. He was a Denisovan, and remarkably, the very first reasonably complete Denisovan skull ever recovered. It's worth pausing on just how significant that specific outcome actually is, because it solves a problem that had genuine truth over the individual's lifetime and remained preserved on its surface for 146,000 years. When the findings were published, this represented among the biggest paleo... Step back and consider the full arc of this story, because it's genuinely remarkable how many separate strands of scientific detective work had to come together to reach this point. A terrified laborer hides a skull in a well specifically to protect it from a wartime occupying army, inadvertently preserving one of the most important human fossils ever found for 85 years. His family finally recovers it decades later and hands it to science. Researchers spend 3 years analyzing its unusual anatomy roots. Published across 2 papers in June 2025, one in the journal Cell and one in Science, the combined findings amounted to about as close to definitive proof as paleogenetics typically gets on a specimen this old and this previously uncertain. Dragon Man wasn't a mysterious, unclassifiable ancient protein analysis and, remarkably, genetic material recovered from fossilized dental plaque. And the eventual answer doesn't just settle what this one particular skull actually was, it retroactively reshapes how researchers are now re-examining an entire scattered collection of previously unclassifiable Fu and her colleagues, described as the first comprehensive morphological blueprint for Denisovan populations, addressing a question that had persisted unresolved for the entire previous decade, what Denisovans actually looked like. And the answer, it turns out, is startling in its own right. A huge, heavily built individual with a massive brow ridge, an enormous jaw and mouth, a broad nose, and a brain as large. Genuinely remarkable how many separate strands of scientific detective work had to come together to reach this point. A terrified laborer hides a skull in a well specifically to protect it from a wartime occupying army, inadvertently preserving across every major AI chatbot, and it becomes especially pronounced on subjects like this one, where an enormous volume of confidently written but scientifically contested material already exists for the model to draw from. None of this means the underlying questions about the pyramids and the Sphinx are boring, or that the people who first raised them were simply cranks. Robert Schoch is a tenured geology professor, not a random internet personality, and his central observation about the enclosure walls has against something that simply didn't exist before 2025. In September of that same year, a separate study proposed that remains from 6 additional sites across China, including a roughly 1 million-year-old skull known as Yongxian over the individual's lifetime and remained preserved on its surface for 146,000 years. Songhai lineage now confirmed to include genetically verified Denisovans. Other previously